the idea here is that there's a probability here of passing an X chromosome to the next generation, and there's an associated probability here, 50% of passing the Y chromosome to the next generation. So if I have 8 children, like the Cup family did, he was a farmer, he wanted a son to help him work the farm, they had 8 children. And of those 8 children, my expectation would be that 50% would be females and 50% would be males. So he had 8 children, he had 8 daughters. Well, that can happen because you're not doing this meiosis trick an infinite number of times. You're only doing it 8 times. And therefore, the probabilities are what they are. So I could say, what's the probability of producing 8 daughters? Right, 8 daughters. Well, the probability of producing a daughter is 1/2, and I need to do it 8 times. So daughter 1, or offspring 1 is a daughter, and offspring 2 is a daughter, and offspring 3 is a daughter, and 4 is a daughter, and 5 is a daughter, and 6 is a daughter, and 7 is a daughter, and 8 is a daughter. So there's a finite probability of producing 8 daughters. Right? It can happen. 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and that probability is 1 out of 256 times. Right? There's an associated probability of getting this condition. This is not what I expect. I expect 4 sons and 4 daughters, but it could very easily go some other way because I'm not doing the probability an infinite number of times. I'm only doing meiosis 8 times, and therefore this sampling error, right, the sampling error comes into play. Sampling error is not error like mistake. It's just a description of where the variation is coming from, what it's attributable to. Okay? All right, and then the last assumption that Hardy and Weinberg had to make, and that is that alleles don't have any particular affinity for other alleles. No choosing alleles. Oops, alleles. That is, if I pull out a big A, I have an equal probability of pulling out a little or a big A. If big A had a choice in the matter and always preferred to be associated with another big A, then that would mess up the probabilities again. So what we're assuming here is that individuals can't choose which alleles to pair up with into the next generation, and that's called no sexual selection. Right, so by making these assumptions, Hardy and Weinberg did something very, very important. They actually gave us a list of the evolutionary forces. These are the forces for evolutionary change. We've talked a lot about one of these. Now we need to talk about the other 4. We're also going to go back and talk about this one again, but we need to pick up all 5 of these forces from an evolutionary perspective. Now, under Hardy and Weinberg's definition, these assumptions that we're making is to assume that these 5 forces are not operating. These 5 are forces for evolutionary change because they have the ability to alter allele frequencies. By definition, an evolutionary force is a force that can change the frequencies of alleles in a population. We talked about the alleles in the bucket, but what we're really talking about are these forces operating on populations. Okay? So what we're going to do now is go ahead and move into talking about each of these evolutionary forces one at a time, talking about the peculiarities of each of these forces, whether they're deterministic or random, and then get a feel for how they operate within populations. Next time what I'll do is have a few Hardy-Weinberg questions for you so that you can see how Hardy-Weinberg operates from the mathematical side. Those of you interested in med school, ultimately it's not unusual for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium math calculations to end up on MCATs. Okay? All right. All right, so let's pick up the first evolutionary force here. Well, let's call mutation. And then recall what a mutation is. A mutation is a change in the sequence of nucleotides within a DNA molecule, right? Or we could talk about changes in RNA sequences with respect to RNA viruses like HIV, but it's a change in the sequence of nucleotides. I do want to point out to you here that this change, there's no qualification here. I'm not saying it's a good change, I'm not saying it's a bad change, I'm not saying it's a change that doesn't have any effect on anything. I'm just saying it's change. And in fact, that's the way we define mutation, is a change in the sequence. Now, what effect that sequence has on individuals is another question, but is it not inherent to mutation to begin with? We often hear the term mutation, we automatically think like Creature from the Black Lagoon, right? Like this shambling kind of mutant creature moving around, and we automatically think bad. But these changes could be good changes, bad changes, or no change at all in terms of phenotype by changing the sequence of alleles. Okay? Then we could ask, well, where do such changes happen? What are the mechanisms that introduce said changes into DNA molecules? Well, one possibility is that during DNA replication, I make a mistake in the copying of the molecule. Right? That's DNA replication. I copied the molecule. I made a mispairing. I introduced a nucleotide in there. And I expect mutations to occur in DNA replication. Now, if I'm passing alleles to the next generation, we're obviously talking about meiosis, but preceding meiosis is a DNA replication step. I have to replicate the DNA before I can do meiosis. Right? I have to replicate the DNA so I can give my offspring a copy of things. Okay? So mutations happen during DNA replication. Okay? Mutations can also happen during meiosis, not just before meiosis in a DNA replication step, but also during meiosis, specifically prophase 1. And the mechanism here is that step called crossing over and recombination. Crossing over and recombination. I have a few slides here just to remind you about things. This is the effects of mutations, right? Sometimes these effects introduce different sequences, sometimes they don't. That would be a mutation that has no effect on things. And here I've got prophase 1 crossing over and recombination to show you what I've done here is taken a sequence of alleles on the blue chromosome and on the red chromosome, and they've been flipped. I've introduced a new sequence of nucleotides into the chromosome. Okay? That's that crossing over and recombination step. Okay? All right. Taking a look at the time here. Trying to decide what to do next based on the time. Let's go ahead and do migration as an evolutionary force. So I'll skip through a couple of the PowerPoints, and then when I've got more time, that is the start of the next lecture, we'll go ahead and do the other evolutionary forces, including natural selection. All right, so migration. In ecology, when we talk about migration, we talk about the movement of an organism from one place to another. herds of buffalo migrating across the plains, or birds around here migrating south and then migrating back to north in the spring. That's an ecological definition. In evolution, the migration is more of a gene flow question. It's not just that individuals move. They do have to move, but when they move, they need to reproduce in a new population. That's part of this gene flow. It's the idea of genes or genetic information flowing from one place to another by organisms reproducing in these new locations. Okay? All right. So, in order to understand this, let's develop a little bit of math around it. So, let's assume here that I've got an island, and over here I have a continent. Now, in these two locations, I have similar alleles, but these alleles may be in different frequencies. So if I'm interested in the frequency of a particular allele, let's say a frequency of the big A allele, which let's call P to simplify things, I recognize that P may be a different value in these two locations. So I could say that the P on the island equals the frequency of the A1 on the island, and the P sub C equals the frequency of the A allele on the continent. And these two values do not have to be the same. In fact, they need to be different in order for this migration process to work. Okay? Next, let's assume that we have some migrants. So, in my population, there's a certain proportion of individuals next year that arrived from the island.